Alrighty. Well, thank you, everybody. If you've made it this far, you know you are at the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. We're super excited to have you here with us for our last session of the day. There's been plenty of sessions since we have breakout rooms. You probably only saw a few, but most of them will be available on our YouTube channel. I'll get into that a little bit more, but just wanted to give a quick introduction. This year, the conference is focused on thriving communities, and each session spotlights a unique approach to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. Please join into our conversation. Since we are fully virtual, our conversation takes place fully online. You can see our different social media tags there. Please be a part of our conversation this year. We love getting to hear what folks have to say and contributing to the conversations that our presenters bring. My name is Danielle Hubley. I manage advocacy and education with the Partnership for Strong Communities, and I have on the call with me Michelle Montano. She is from the Narrative Project, who works alongside the partnership in our communications efforts. She and I will be here to help assist in case any attendees have any questions or are struggling to navigate the platform. We can help try and troubleshoot with you. The session you are at today is a qualitative evaluation of the Connecticut Right to Counsel program. Before I pass it off to our presenters, I just want to give a quick round of thank yous to our leading sponsor, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our visionary sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing and Wells Fargo, our champion sponsors, Bank of America, J.D. Amelia Associates, M&T Bank, Webster Bank, and the Melville Charitable Trust. And our foundation sponsors, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, Cohen Resnick, and Trinity Financial. I also want to give a quick thank to Hartford Healthcare and the Welcome Home Hartford group as being the sponsors for this particular session today. Just in general, our sponsors are a huge part of the reason why this conference is available and affordable to so many. It's why we can host it for free. So we're super grateful for their support and participation in the conference. So thank you so much to all of our sponsors. A few quick items of housekeeping. Like I said, this session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube account sometime in the days and weeks following the conference. So keep an eye out for content there. You have all entered muted. Please remain muted unless your speakers ask you to engage in the conversation. Please be respectful of that and mindful of that as you move through the session. As I said before, if you have a technology issue, there is a chat icon in the Zoom control panel, and just click on, again, my name or Michelle's and let us know what concerns you have or challenges you're coming up against, and we'll do our best to troubleshoot in the moment. Your speakers will let you know how they would like you to engage in Q&A for this session, although there is a chat feature like a normal Zoom meeting, so please feel free to use that to engage the panelists today. And the last thing I really have to say is that we have session surveys for each of the sessions you attend today. You will get a little notification on the megaphone icon that you see on your screen right now. It's only 9 questions. It's super quick to fill out, but it gives us a lot of really important critical feedback to make sure that the conference is getting the content to you that you want to be seeing. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm super excited to pass it off to Annie to kick it off with her team for this wonderful conversation.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the introduction. Let me share my screen, and forgive me in advance for any technical glitches, which I'm sure will happen. We will be trying to use something called Menti, which is a first time for me, so you will be the pilot program for that. So can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So we're presenting our qualitative evaluation of the Connecticut Right to Counsel program. You have with me today presenting, so I'm Annie Harper. With me is T. Calloway with Mothers and Others for Justice. She was a member of the Community Advisory Board for this project, and Gabriela Vargas, who's in the Yale School of Public Health and conducted the study with myself, and Danya Keene, also from Yale School of Public Health, who's not here. So this is just the agenda we'll go through. We'll give you some background about Right to Counsel. Not quite sure how many of you know about it. T will share her own personal story. We'll talk about the evaluation and the findings. And then we'll end with some Q&A. So just for background, the Connecticut Right to Counsel program was enacted by the Connecticut General Assembly in May 2021. It was the first statewide right to counsel in the country, and that just means that people who are facing eviction and who are eligible based on income have the right to have an attorney for free if they get a notice to quit and are being threatened with eviction. The program was funded. It's now expanded across 17 cities and 11 states, and that was a few months ago. It might even be more now. The program was funded with $20 million of funding from the American Rescue Plan funds, and eligibility is based on income. So anyone who earns 80% or less of the state median income is eligible if they are at risk of eviction or losing their housing subsidy. I say the whole state. It is continuing to be rolled out across the state. It didn't start. It still hasn't reached every zip code. It was initially rolled out in 14 of the state's 438 zip codes. Those initial zip codes were selected because of historically high eviction rates in those areas. 32% of eviction cases in 2019 were in those 14 zip codes. Veterans anywhere in the state have been eligible from the beginning. The program is administered by the Connecticut Bar Foundation, and they engaged 5 legal service providers around the state to provide the service. So that rollout started in February, and right from the very beginning, an evaluation was built in because, as I said, this is the first state in the country where this was happening. So it's super important to understand, if it works, how it works, where the gaps are. So an organization called Stout was brought in to do a large quantitative evaluation, basically using data from every single client served through the program. And then we were engaged to do a complementary qualitative evaluation. The point being that while you can see an awful lot about what's happening or what isn't happening with the data that you can get from the surveys that people fill in as they use the service, through the qualitative evaluation, we were able to, with a much smaller number of people, but really dig into some of the details of what it feels like to be evicted, of what it feels like to have an attorney in an eviction situation. And also we talked to a number of people who actually had not had the opportunity to use right to counsel, so got some of that perspective as well. We started our data collection in May, and we completed data collection in April in May 2022. We completed data collection in April of this year. So Tracy's asking, is there a link for residents to go to your website to get information firsthand? Please do throw questions in the chat as we go along. There's information about right to counsel. You can actually just Google right to counsel Connecticut. If you're talking about our report, that is not yet available, but it will be soon, and we'll make sure that everybody here has access to the report. Tracy, did that answer your question? Okay, great. So we just want to start off to get a sense of where hang on a minute, am I on the right thing? Okay, yeah. Give me a second. So I'm now going to do the thing which I might screw up, which is to go to the Menti thing. We want to just find out something about what you currently know or don't know about the Right to Counsel program. So can you see the screen which says Menti on it? Okay. Yes. So if you go to menti.com, www.menti.com, or use the QR code, go to that website and enter the code 76122922. I'll put that in the chat. So is everyone able to do that? Okay, nobody's saying they haven't, so I will assume. All right. So Gabby, correct me if I'm going wrong, but I think you will see a question and it asks you, do you have right to counsel available in your zip code? So anyone, let us know, do you have right to counsel available? Yes, no, or you don't know? I'll give you a couple minutes to answer that. Again, if you're not able to if you haven't been able to do it, go to menti.com and enter the code you see at the top of the screen. So just a few people have answered, but 2 people know that they, oh, more people are answering. I'll give you just a couple more moments. So it seems like 5 people do have right to counsel available in their zip code and 4 don't know. That's important because that tells us something about knowledge about right to counsel, and that is indeed one of our findings. So I'm going to move to the next. Oh, here we go. More people. 6 people have it in their zip code and 4 don't know. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question, which I hope you can see in your Menti. And this is whether you have read the Stout Connecticut Eviction Right to Counsel evaluation. So this was the quantitative evaluation that was conducted, and the report was produced, I'm not sure exactly when, but maybe earlier this year, right, Gabby?
End of last year.
Okay, end of last year. So it's been a while since that report has been available. Okay, so this is also interesting because it's a publicly available report, and it would be really great I think it's important that people know how the program is working. I will say we found, and Stout also found, the first year of operations is probably not the fairest year to assess this program because there were a lot of kind of things being worked out in the process. But it's interesting to know that most people have not read that. So again, we will maybe, Gabby, while you're talking, I'll find the link to that report and share it in the chat later on so that people have access to that when they want it. Okay, thank you for your participation there. So I'm now going to hand it over to T, who will tell us something from her experience about why eviction matters and why it's so important that people do have access to support in those situations. T, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tarsha Calloway, T for short. I went through my ordeal, and I do call it an ordeal. There was a knock at the door. I had little kids, so they all arrived with me at the door. I was handed a thick piece of paperwork by a marshal who had a police officer standing on the sidewalk with him, and was told that I had 3 or 7 days to vacate, that I was being evicted. And, at first of all, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I see the police, the marshal has, a badge on, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like my head is kind of like in a fishbowl at the time. And I have my kids right there because, we didn't expect any of this. And I'm just, like, oh, I didn't even know what to do or what to say. And he's letting me know that if I'm not out, that the police are going to be back and they're going to take everything out for me if I'm not out. And I'm just like, I have a 4-bedroom house. I have all these kids, and I have nowhere to go. So, and, he wasn't even nice. He didn't even try to explain anything to me. I didn't know what to say because I wasn't even familiar with eviction and the process. I didn't know what, why, how, what was going on. And he didn't even say, like, ma'am, you might want to just, tell the kids to go back in the house. I'm just kind of like going through this in front of them. And, he was just like, down to the letter, just, stating what I had to do, what was going to happen, and just not even trying to, he didn't even say, hello, ma'am, I'm sorry, I'm here to kind of give you a little bad news. You might want to put the kids away for a second. If you want to talk to me for a second. No, it was just like, kind of like an attack. I mean, unfortunately, to this day, I hear a knock at the door or I hear a doorbell, and that trauma comes right back to me. And I don't think any public servant in any way, shape, or form should not impact your life so badly where you have a lasting feeling for so long that you can't even, it's in your mind, like when something simple as a door knock or doorbell could, happens near you. tricks, intimidation. The police officer there, that was just an intimidation. Like he wasn't able to do anything. He shouldn't have been there. Should have been just a marshal. And I just think it could have just been a really an empathetic situation where, this is a lot. And I didn't act in any sort of way for him to, just kind of come at me like he did. But if he would have been like a true public servant that cares about the community, he could have said, do you have any questions? Are you okay? Or something like that, not so, deep in, empathy, but just a little bit of I guess care for the situation that, I was being dealt with. And I had all this paperwork and there was nothing else given to me. And I was just scared and just confused and I felt intimidated. And I after he left, I couldn't even think. I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, I have to move a 4-bedroom home that me and my children have lived in. I don't even know why in 3 days or 7 days. I wasn't sure which one it was. So, that's my story. I don't wish it on anyone because it literally is a lasting trauma that I had to go through. And I literally still feel to this day, I still have goosebumps. I remember the police officer. He didn't even look like he wanted to be there. I think he knew that that was bad, that he really shouldn't have been there, that he was kind of being part of the intimidation. But I didn't know. So if you don't know, you can't protect yourself. And I couldn't protect myself and my kids from that situation. And it got bad. So that's my story. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing, T. I know that isn't easy. And I will say how much we value T and the experience of other people who have been given the support they need and are able to share their stories, because we know that there's a lot of shame and stigma around things like eviction. So yeah, really appreciate you sharing, T, and all the work you've done to support this project and help people appreciate the value of what's going on here. So let me just share my screen again. So as I said, our role in this, and I include T and all the other members of the Community Advisory Board, was to understand from a qualitative perspective what is the value of right to counsel, how's it working, where are some of the gaps. So we actually partnered with we were asked to do it in three cities, 3 of the places where right to counsel, or 3 locations where right to counsel was being rolled out: New Haven, Hartford, and Wyndham. We partnered with 3 paid organizations that we paid to help us with this. Perceptions in Wyndham, why is my brain going blank, in Hartford, and Mothers and Others for Justice in New Haven. And those a community action agency, CRT, in Hartford. And those organizations helped us put together focus groups. And the goal of the focus groups was to understand kind of what do we even need to be asking about when we're interviewing people? What are the key issues? What does eviction mean to people? What might it mean to have right to counsel? Because at this stage, very few people had actually been able to use the program. So we had those 3 focus groups where we really just opened the room up to people and said, look, we want to evaluate this program. What should that look like? How should we approach people? What should we be asking? What do we need to be taking care about? And T was, one of the people who helped us understand that. We then identified tenants across those 3 locations, and indeed actually in some tenants from outside those locations, and had in-depth interviews with each of those tenants. We had people referred to us by the right to counsel providers. So we were speaking to some people who'd been through right to counsel. And then we also spoke with people who had experienced eviction but hadn't been through right to counsel. And then we spoke with some people who were kind of threatened with eviction and hadn't connected with a program yet, but were planning to, or we actually helped connect them. And we also spoke to a number of other stakeholders, including attorneys, some landlords, some housing service providers, and then some advocates and activists to understand their perspectives about right to counsel. And we had a community advisory board, as I said, that was 12 people, including people who had been through eviction themselves or housing insecurity, as well as people with long professional experience in housing across those 3 locations. So the way that qualitative research works is you basically do have lots and lots of conversations with people until you have like a ton of transcripts of conversations, and then we read through it repeatedly, a team of people, to try and get a sense of what themes are coming out. So what we're going to present now is the themes that that we identified through these kind of multiple readings of all of the transcripts that we got through the research. Oops, excuse me. So the first couple of slides here are going to be, I'm just going to talk a bit about what we learned about the need for having a right to counsel. And there was some kind of misconceptions from the beginning about, you know, what can right to counsel do, given that if people can't pay their rent, they can't pay their rent. And that is indeed a problem, as we'll talk about later. But we found, as the stout quantitative evaluation found, that most of the people being served, being supported by right to counsel, actually were dealing with really complex situations around their housing. It wasn't simply a matter of not being able to pay rent, though that is a huge problem, but there were lots of other kind of complicated issues that it was really important to have an attorney help with. So in the first year of right to counsel, the Stout report, which, as I said, they looked at all of the data, basically every single person who used the service, and they found that 59% of right to counsel clients reported substandard housing conditions. And of the cases that received extensive legal support through right to counsel, 100% of those were complex cases. So just really showing that often in eviction cases, there are very complicated legal issues that it's not that someone without legal expertise cannot really be expected to manage by themselves. So this just a couple of quotes from people who, someone who said she had mold, she had a leaking ceiling, she was about to have a child, and this was someone who actually had been evicted already. This was before right to counsel was available, and this person was evicted. They weren't able to get the legal assistance that might have helped them deal with those housing conditions and stay in their home. And then someone we spoke to in Hartford, who actually did go through right to counsel and was successfully able to stay in her home. She had lived there for many years, and when a new landlord bought the building and did not maintain the property as it was required, and I guess because it was a new landlord, it was inspected by RAP. She got a housing subsidy and it didn't pass inspection. So RAP stopped paying because the house wasn't, it didn't pass the inspection. So they tried to evict her for not paying her rent, but it was because the RAP wasn't being paid. And she got a notice to quit, and had she not known about right to counsel and contacted it, she actually would have just left. But through right to counsel, she was able to stay. One of the other types of complex issues is around disability, that people who have a disability or are over the age of 62, they actually have different rights than other people. And there were a number of cases where people were informed about those rights through access to an attorney. The other thing is that we found that people really, the access to legal assistance before right to counsel was very limited. I think we know that, I'm not sure, but I think only prior to right to counsel, only 7 to 8% of tenants were represented by a lawyer, and a third of tenants didn't even show up in court when there was they had an eviction. So these quotes just really talk about the experiences that people had when they did not have legal assistance and they were being evicted. So this is a person just describing how she was basically intimidated by the process of eviction, and she basically felt all by herself and she had to leave. And then Elena was telling us how she did actually try to get legal assistance to help her with her eviction case, and there was absolutely no way that she could afford what she was being asked to pay. And I'll just finish by saying, in Connecticut, so housing cases are not like many other legal cases. They're what's called summary proceedings, and I know there are lawyers here. If I say something wrong, apologies, you can correct me. But they're basically designed to happen quickly and return the property to the owner with an assumption that there are no substantive legal issues. So it happens very, very quickly. And for people who don't have legal knowledge, it's really, I think, as T mentioned, there's no time to think about it, right? You have a few days and many people just move. Okay, so I'm now going to turn it over to Gabby, who'll talk more about some of the things that we found about when people did have access to right to counsel.
Thank you, Annie. And please feel free to say anything if I forget something. Yeah, so we also wanted to discuss in our findings the impacts of CTRTC on tenant housing outcomes and tenant well-being. Our data showed how lawyers can help tenants stay in their homes when it's likely that they would otherwise have been evicted. In some cases, the lawyers prevented evictions by informing tenants of their rights and providing advice about the steps to take. And other times, lawyers provided guidance that empowered and allowed tenants to self-advocate. Sometimes lawyers enabled tenants to avoid an eviction judgment by helping them find resources to pay off rent arrears and be able to afford rent in the future. In other situations, lawyers can prevent eviction by assisting tenants in addressing issues related to any housing subsidies, like Annie talked about with Tara in the slide before. Or for protected tenant statuses. For example, Paige from Milford and her husband were served a notice to quit even though they were not behind on rent. When Paige was connected to CTRTC, the lawyer decided not to represent them, but to provide advice about how best to represent themselves because they had such a strong case and her husband was a protected tenant, had a protected tenant status. And also their address was at the time not eligible for the program. However, the lawyer had to make an emergency appearance when the mediator intimidated her into accepting a deal to leave. In other cases, landlords violated tenants' rights and lawyers could dismiss the eviction cases, such as with Luke from New Haven. Luke's landlord tried to evict him to turn the property into a sober house. The lawyer informed the landlord that he couldn't evict Luke because of his protected status and because they had invaded Luke's privacy by installing a camera facing his window without him knowing. After this, the landlord ended up just dropping the case and Luke got to stay in his home. In addition, our interview suggests that CTRTC can support tenants with behavioral health challenges to retain their housing, especially when the harm caused by losing housing can be so severe for people with mental health challenges. Next slide. Thank you. And so tenants using CTRTC were not always able to stay in their homes. Sometimes remaining wasn't economically feasible for tenants. Sometimes tenants wanted to move elsewhere. One tenant, Sandra from Manchester, fell behind on rent during the pandemic because of an income gap. And so she received a notice to quit. After reaching out to CTRTC, Sandra and the lawyer decided that it wouldn't be possible to catch up on rent, even though she was now employed again. The lawyer helped Sandra to negotiate a move-out date 6 weeks away. This extra time allowed Sandra to plan to move in with her mom and pack her things. Sandra avoided having an eviction on her record, which would enable her to find a new place and remain eligible for rental subsidies. Although the move had significant associated costs, Sandra compared the experience to a previous eviction that she had, where she didn't have any legal counsel and she felt that she had no power to even come to an agreement with the landlord. And then another tenant, Dominic, a veteran from Bristol who had lived in his building for 20 years, was asked to leave one day along with the other tenants in the building because the landlord had sold the building. Dominic didn't want to even stay in the building, but finding a new place to rent on his fixed income was really challenging. So the landlord served Dominic multiple notices to quit, even though he was in a protected tenant status. He was over 62. The landlord offered him $3,000 to leave and threatened him with filing with an eviction filing on his record. Dominic declined and said that $3,000 wasn't worth being on the streets. His RTC lawyer advised him to stay and continue paying rent until he found a replacement housing, a VA dormitory where he was placed on the wait list for subsidized housing for the elderly. And then in other cases, landlords exercise their right to remove a tenant without cause at the end of the lease term. For example, Monique from Willimantic fell behind on rent after her father passed away from an aggressive cancer. While she was dealing with her father's illness, she experienced a significant income gap. She couldn't prevent falling behind on rent, even though she had substantial savings as a real estate agent. So Monique used in a rent assistance from Unite CT to pay back rent, and the lawyer helped to get her case dismissed. She could stay until the end of her lease, but she couldn't renew it because the landlord had a policy that you couldn't renew a lease if you had legal action. So Monique would have liked to stay where she lived, and it took a while to save enough security deposit for a new place. But she was grateful that the lawyer was grateful to the lawyer for helping her make sure that she had enough time to prepare to leave, and had enough time with her children to move, and that she could avoid having an eviction on her record. Even in these cases, our interviews show that CTRTC could help negotiate exits that really minimized adverse impacts for tenants, and ensured that the property owners got back their property in a timely manner. And in all these three examples, all these tenants paid rent up until they moved. Next slide. Awesome. So beyond preventing forced moves, our data also show that CTRTC can shape the experiences of eviction in ways that likely support tenants' well-being. Many tenants described how having a lawyer really reduced the stress and anxiety associated with the eviction process, regardless of the case's outcome. Just like in T's story, other tenants appreciated the help that lawyers provided with navigating a bureaucratically complicated process. Tenants explained that lawyers are not simply someone on their side. They also have legal knowledge that tenants perceive as protective and empowering. Tenants said that having a lawyer during the eviction process made them feel less intimidated by this power imbalance between them and their landlord. In the New Haven focus group, one participant spoke of the value of having a lawyer regardless of the outcome. They said that having a lawyer evens out the playing field, and it just makes you feel better to have someone there. A tenant described how their landlord's behavior changed when they were able to obtain legal assistance. So for Sonia, a tenant from New Haven who connected to CTRTC soon after receiving a notice to quit, explained that as soon as the landlord found out that she was using CTRTC, the phone calls, the letters on the door, and the visits from the marshal just stopped. Next slide. Thank you. And so landlords have more power than tenants during the formal eviction process, given the greater likelihood that they have legal counsel, and that the legal process currently favors landlords. Even outside the eviction process, landlords have a considerable power over the tenants. Tenants depend on the owners for roof over their heads, and have almost no negotiating power, especially low-income tenants in a tight rental market and very few alternative housing options. These power dynamics can really undermine tenants' rights and well-being, while having access to legal counsel when threatened with eviction does not change the fundamental power imbalance between landlords and tenants. Our data suggests that CTRTC can begin to rebalance it to some extent. Some tenants told us that the fear of eviction really prevents them from asking landlords to perform required maintenance, or to even address very serious health hazards. They told us that the fear of an eviction record and lack of knowledge of their rights could result in their deciding to leave before even facing eviction. For example, Sylvia from Wyndham was asked by her landlord to leave her home with her son. She shared with us that she didn't really know why she didn't know her rights, and she wasn't sure why she was being asked to leave. So she left the same day, and she didn't even bother to seek help. Some tenants told us that they think that CTRTC may also encourage property owners to make different decisions about whether to initiate an eviction. Tanya from New Haven shared that CTRTC can stop landlords who believe that they can do whatever they want. once they see that tenants have counsel, it can make them think twice before initiating an eviction. And next slide. Thank you. And like Annie said, the research team also interviewed rental property owners and their lawyers, and they raised several concerns about CTRTC. They talked about the financial implications of what they thought was an already increasingly lengthy eviction process. Rental property owners said that increasing the length and the difficulty of the eviction process could have unintended consequences for the rental market by making owners reluctant to take a chance on a tenant that they thought was risky. And so they felt the need to implement these stricter screening practices. However, it's important to note that several changes to landlord screening requirements happened before CTRTC and may be related to other factors, such as tight rental market and owners' experiences during the eviction moratoria. Some rental property owners wanted alternatives to the eviction process, such as mediation. However, in all we heard, there were similarities between the tenants, advocates, and housing service providers, including the need for more tenant-based assistance and a desire for more eviction prevention resources, such as early access mediation and eviction diversion. Though property owners had concerns about CTRTC, many agreed that tenant representation and access to legal services was warranted and essential in some situations. They said that some property owners take advantage of tenants or they fail to maintain properties, and that protecting tenants in these circumstances was important. And in other locations, landlords have been very supportive of tenant RTC. Landlords are essential stakeholders in CTRTC, and engaging them and then in their concerns is critical. And Annie, if you want to add anything else. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. Just before I move on, just to, I guess, summarize that, you know, Gabby spoke about how we found that evictions were prevented in some cases, which is obviously kind of the key goal of right to counsel. But I think what we were able to dig into is the way that even when people did end up having to move, the trauma of that experience seemed to be considerably softened by having a lawyer on your side. So to kind of soften the blow, give people more time, just a sort of a sense of how it's going to go. So not being in such a panic about what to do. I know that people, if you move quickly, you might have to dump your stuff, like knowing that you have time to put your stuff in storage, to find somewhere else to stay temporarily. None of these things are good outcomes, but they are improved outcomes compared to, I think, what T went through, just having to kind of move very suddenly. And also from a mental health perspective, I'm a mental health researcher. Many stories talking about how just regardless of the outcome, one of the quotes Gabby mentioned, knowing that there's someone who actually knows how the system works on your side does play a role in reducing the stress associated with a really, really horrendous situation. And then what they're talking about the shift in power. Both Gabby and I have been involved in other research around with tenants, and this fear of making very valid complaints about housing conditions, etc., repeatedly hearing from people that they're afraid to make those complaints for fear that their landlord will retaliate in some way, whether that means evicting them at the end of their lease, evicting them for some other cause, or putting up the rent. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about so those were some of kind of the positive things that we heard about right to counsel. There are definitely some limitations that we heard about, especially in the early months. There was real frustration that some people had heard about this service and weren't able to access it. Or so if you look at the second quote there, somebody said that she had called right to counsel because she'd heard about it and was told that they aren't taking any clients because of high call volume. So as I said, first, the service was only available in a limited number of zip codes, and a couple of those zip codes actually had to shut down temporarily because they were overwhelmed with calls from clients who needed their assistance. It was difficult to to hire the number of lawyers needed, and then to train them to be able to provide this service. So there were definitely some kind of initial problems with access, and I think that those problems are much better than they were, but they still exist, which I think just points to the extremely high need for, the high rate of evictions that we see in Connecticut and the need for legal assistance for so many people. So that's an ongoing issue. There was some confusion about eligibility because some people were getting notice. So the way that right to counsel works for most people is landlords have to affix it to the notice to quit. So people should see it when it's attached, when they see it and when they get their notice to quit papers. One of the issues is that some people got that notice, but actually they lived in a different zip code. So they called and then found they weren't eligible, and that led to some frustration. There was some concerns about people who were undocumented getting the impression that they weren't eligible, whereas in fact they are. And then this quote here from Tamika in Hartford shows that even when it kind of happened as it was supposed to, some people just didn't see the piece of paper attached to their notice to quit. So she said how when she got it, she knew she happened to know that that it existed, but she was frustrated that it wasn't very clearly shown in the piece of paper that she got. And we also had someone who told us, like, do you really think when I get that big pack of papers, that notice to quit, that I read through it carefully and go all the way to that last back page? Like, I'm so stressed, all I see is the fact that it's a notice to quit. So there's definitely some issues around kind of access. And then just one issue there is that one final issue is that we did hear from people that they just didn't trust the system. Somebody said, like, why, lawyers have never helped me before. Why would they help me now? I'm not even going to bother to call. I just need to get a move on and move out. So there are a number of issues around access. I will say that we got the impression towards the last interviews that we were doing that there was much more information about right to counsel than there used to be. So that's definitely seems to be improving. I think really the biggest limitation, unsurprisingly, that we came across is that while we found some amazing benefits of right to counsel, but fundamentally, if people can't afford to pay their rent, then having a lawyer can soften the blow of eviction. But unless there's funding available, like through Unite CT, to pay for arrears or to help people pay their rent going forward, then if there's this gap between income and the cost of rent, legal assistance can't help with that. And that really did come up over and over and over again, that it's great to have a lawyer, but if I can't afford to pay my rent, I can't afford to pay my rent. So that's a kind of fundamental problem that obviously this conference is all about. And acknowledging also that when it's so incredibly difficult to find a place to live, to find an affordable place to live, that reduces tenant power even further because of that issue of being afraid of losing the place that you can maybe just hang on to right now, means that tenants really have no leverage at all. So the second quote regards a case where even though someone was, and this, I think we had a few cases, a few situations described to us like this, where somebody through right to counsel was able to avoid eviction, but then at the end of their lease, the landlord asked them to leave. And in this case, as I think Gabby mentioned earlier, somebody who, because the landlord told her that because she had brought in a lawyer to try and prevent the eviction, he said, I don't want anyone who's brought legal action against me. So again, I think we heard quite a few times people who had their eviction prevented, but then they had to leave at the end of their lease. And just to reiterate, what probably isn't a surprise to anyone here, but the consequences of eviction, I think T's story at the beginning really helped us understand the trauma associated simply with being given a notice to quit, which she didn't even talk about the things that happened after that. So just taking us back to the really high stakes of eviction, we spoke with someone in Wyndham who had gone through some real personal loss and was suffering with his mental health, and basically just like gave up the place he lived, put what he could in storage, and is living in a tent in the woods. So, the obvious thing, if you get evicted, it might lead to actual homelessness. And then when somebody is evicted, and they have an eviction on their record, the difficulties that people have in finding a place both that they can afford and that will accept somebody with an eviction on their record. And this particular person knew people who were better off than she was financially, so could co-sign, which enabled her to get a place. But for many people, having evictions on your record really is sort of condemns them to being homeless and having to live with other people or actually be on the streets. We also know from the research that we've done, that others have done. Danya, who wasn't able to be with us today presenting, has done a lot of this research, showing the negative impacts of eviction on health, on adult health, on children's health, and then generally on well-being and children's education. There's all sorts of ramifications of the negative impacts of eviction on families' lives. We were going to tell Paige's story. I think Gabby already covered it. I think I have a couple of moments where I just want to share one more story that we have. So we spoke with a veteran. Her name was, I'll call her Rebecca, who was living in New Haven and had fallen behind on her rent after dropping out of college due to mental health problems associated with the pandemic lockdown. She was a mother and was struggling with having her kids at home. She had a stipend from the VA, but it was contingent on her being enrolled in school. So when she had to drop out of school, she lost her stipend and wasn't able to pay her rent. She had applied for various rental assistance programs, but wasn't able to get what she needed. And as she was thinking about eviction and worrying about the impact on her kids, her mental health worsened. And when she did eventually hear about Right to Counsel, she was assisted with the lawyers in finding funding to help both with her back rent and connect her with a program that was going to subsidize her rent for the next 2 years. And a quote from Rebecca was, "I never had to go to court and I was able to get the funds through different programs. We put a plan in place." So that's an example of how someone was helped with a lawyer without even having to go through court, right? They helped connect her with the programs that were able to give her the funding she needed to be able to pay her rent for the next 2 years, by which time hopefully she'll be at finished school and have a job and be able to pay it herself. So what we're going to do now is do another Menti thing. So if you can go back to the Menti website, and I think if we've got it right, that you will see a question there. What steps can you and or your organization take to strengthen Right to Counsel? We'd just love to hear from you all what you think you can do to strengthen the program and make it more impactful. Are people able to access it? So inform clients, let people know that Right to Counsel is out there. Any other ideas? Right. Push for more funding, absolutely, great point, because the funding was for 2 years. I believe it's been extended for some time, but it needs to be permanent, as people are saying. And I think publicizing its success is important. The Stout report really has a ton of information in there about the positive impacts of this program, as does our report, which will be out soon. And it needs more funding, both to continue, but also to expand. Okay, I'll move to the next one. So as we explained, Right to Counsel seems to be having a really positive impact, but there are many things which Right to Counsel can't address. So what steps can you and or your organization take to support additional legislation required to ensure housing security? What else do we need to be doing at the legislative, at the policy level, to make sure that as many people as possible don't have to be evicted? Any thoughts about what legislation needs to happen to ensure housing security? And I guess not just legislation, but anything that we need to be doing to beyond Right to Counsel to make sure that people are able to stay in their homes. Income supports, education of rights, testifying, making sure that you know if there's appropriate housing legislation being proposed so that we can testify in support of that. Calling or writing legislators. More housing. This is, I feel like, I mean, maybe because I live in Connecticut and this is the environment I work in, but there is a robust debate going on around housing development, what it looks like to make sure that there's enough housing for everyone who needs it. And as we know, there's all sorts of debates and controversies around how that should happen and where it should happen. Promote tenant unions. I couldn't agree more. And that is, I think, a really exciting development that we've seen in Connecticut over the past couple of years. Is we had in fact, the success of right to counsel in Connecticut was largely due to tenant movements, right? Tenants coming together with allies to, initially there was a call to cancel rent, but it kind of morphed into a call for right to counsel. And I think that the success of right to counsel has fed the growth of tenant unions. We now have a statewide Connecticut Tenants Union. The tenant unions are being created across the state in different locations. And I personally think that's one of the key ways to move towards greater housing security, whatever that looks like. Invite presenters locally. I'm not sure what that means. What I will do now, we have about 5 minutes or so left. If anyone has any comments, questions, criticisms, whatever you like, please share in the chat or just go off mute and share.
Hi, Annie. Good to see you.
Tammy, how are you?
I'm good. I do have a question about the source of funding. Was this originally COVID relief dollars?
It was American Rescue Plan funding, yes. $20 million.
Yeah. So legislative proposals with fiscal notes, given the spending cap, are like really challenged in the upcoming session. How long is the current, like when's the expiration date of the current funding?
That I'm not entirely sure about. Maybe someone in the room knows better. It was supposed to be for 2 years, but I believe it was extended because it took a while to get off the ground. But whether it's imminently or not so imminently, it will be fairly soon. But I'm not sure.
Thanks, Annie.
I'll stop share so we can see each other. Does anyone know the answer to Tammy's question about when the funding is expected to end? This year. Right. And this year is nearly over. So. And so Tracy's saying with a tenant union, you have to explain how it works to the residents. Some people do not know the process or that they have a right to form one. Tracy, can you say a bit more about that?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I work for a Fair Rent Commission here in the city of New Haven. I'm the data control clerk alongside my supervisor, Mrs. Wildelise Bermudez. She's the director of Fair Rent Commission. You have to advocate and explain it to residents that they do have a right to form a tenants union if they have at least 50 families or more in the building. We have had 2 cases that made New Haven register recently, so it's public information and you can look it up and take a look at the case. I won't say the names, but the tenants weren't even aware that they had the right to do that alongside filing complaints with the Fair Rent Commission for unsafe, unhealthy, and excessive rent hikes. So we recently had a press conference about 2 months ago here in New Haven, right here at City Hall, for one of the larger management companies for our location on Blake Street. That's the name of the apartment complex. And there was another separate case also. But a lot of times they don't know. All they have to do is communicate with each other, make sure they have the right amount of people to start one. And of course, select neighbors who want to help coordinate and be in charge and sign a petition and start a petition. So you have to tell them what the process is. Some of them don't even know that it exists. and that they do have a right to do that. So that's another thing. You have to inform people and you have to advocate for one another, especially as neighbors. Because if your neighbors in a building and you don't ever communicate with each other and don't talk to each other, how are you going to know? So that's important. That's all I wanted to comment on with that.
I so appreciate your sharing that, Tracy. And
You're
I think
welcome.
what's happening in New Haven and maybe some other cities points to what can the work that can be done at the municipal level to further the rights of tenants. And I think New Haven has done an amazing job. The Fair Rent Commission has been absolutely central to that. Samela is asking, is there an estimate of how much will be required in government funding to expand the Right to Counsel program to all municipalities? I don't know. I just want, does anyone else have an answer to that question? My guess is that if it was an estimate, it would be very much an estimate, because I think this last year and a half of Right to Counsel, there have been a lot of lessons learned in terms of what type of support to provide to tenants in which different situations. Because as I said, I think there are kind of three different types of support. One is full representation in court. The other is extensive legal assistance, but not in court. And then there's pro se, when lawyers advise tenants to represent themselves. And I think there's been a lot of lessons learned around kind of what is the best approach in which situation, which has implications for, you know, attorneys' time and cost. But I don't know the answer to that question. I think we're coming up for the end of the session. So if there aren't any questions, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for the good questions. And I think Gabby has put a link to the Stout report in the chat. Well worth a read, and our report will be available soon as well, and we'll make sure it's shared with whoever can contact you guys.